if we imagine a modern society whose early history survived only as distant stories written down centuries later. We would hesitate to call that account solid history. At best, we would treat it as tradition, valuable for what it suggests, but unreliable as direct evidence. This thought experiment mirrors the problem historians face when studying the Anglo-Saxon settlement of England. For the period between the mid-5th and mid-7th centuries, there are no truly contemporary written records. What survives was written long after the events themselves, shaped by memory, storytelling, and interpretation rather than direct observation. The writings of Bede mark a clear dividing line. When he describes events close to his own lifetime, his work stands as genuine contemporary history. For this, his importance is unquestionable. But when he turns to the earliest Anglo-Saxon migrations and settlements, he is describing events that took place many generations before he was born. In these cases, he relied almost entirely on tradition. He likely did so carefully and honestly, but later writers often treated these early sections with more certainty than Bede himself would probably have claimed. Over time, tradition hardened into narrative, and narrative into accepted history. To understand this early period more fully, we must look beyond written chronicles alone. Other forms of evidence offer valuable clues. Ancient customs, early legal practices, patterns of inheritance, and especially place names all preserve traces of how early communities were organized. These fragments, when studied together, can help reconstruct aspects of settlement that written sources cannot clearly explain. They point towards social structures rooted not in centralized states, but in kinship, clan, and tribal identity. Research of this kind is slow and often frustrating. Progress is rarely dramatic. Yet by carefully comparing English evidence with similar material from northern Germany and Scandinavia, small but meaningful insights emerge. Shared customs, comparable legal ideas, and striking similarities in place names suggest deep connections between the settlers of England and specific regions across the North Sea. These parallels are not accidental. They reflect the movement of related groups who carried their social habits and naming traditions with them. At the heart of this process lies tribal organisation. Many features of early English society make little sense unless we understand that law, land holding, and identity were originally based on family and clan rather than territory. Entire communities were known by collective names, often derived from a common ancestor or founding group. Some modern place names still preserve these origins, while others point to clans whose names have otherwise disappeared from memory. Differences in local customs, especially those governing inheritance, likely reflect the survival of older tribal traditions long after political unity had formed. Even the familiar labels Angles, Saxons, and Jutes can be misleading. These were not nations in the modern sense, but broad names covering loose confederations of tribes. The settlers spoke related forms of speech that could be understood across groups, but these were not yet a single language. Over centuries, these dialects slowly blended, though traces of their differences remain visible in regional speech patterns even today. Place names provide some of the most durable evidence of this early world. Most English place names are Germanic in origin, though not all can be confidently explained. Some describe physical features such as hills, rivers, forests, or crossings, and many of these names may have been assigned after settlement was already well established. Others, however, are far older. Names derived from clans or family groups likely date back to the earliest phases of settlement, whether they originated from a large kin group or from the followers of a single leader. In the earliest communities, law was not tied to fixed borders, but to people. Justice was administered by families and kindreds, not by territorial authorities. Communities named themselves, but the names that endured were often those used by their neighbours. Over time, many of these names vanished, even in regions considered the heartland of early Anglo-Saxon power. Countless place names recorded in early documents can no longer be identified. This loss reminds us how incomplete the historical record truly is. Alongside Germanic names, the English landscape also preserves words for natural features that belong to an even earlier past. These hints point to populations that existed before the Anglo-Saxons arrived. Reading the map of England is like examining a layered manuscript, where each generation has written over the last. Linguists offer powerful tools to interpret these layers, but language alone cannot explain everything. Cultural practices, technology, and social organization do not always move in step with grammar and sound changes. Some of the most revealing place names are those formed from family relationships. Names built around the idea of descent or belonging indicate communities that define themselves through ancestry. Such names could refer to the descendants of a single individual, to a wider kin group, or to the people inhabiting a particular district. In some cases, these naming patterns match those found in parts of continental Europe, especially in regions known to have close ties to the early Saxons. Similar endings appear across Germany and into northeastern France, tracing the paths of related groups who moved in different directions, some southward on the continent, others across the sea into Britain. Most early English place names were built from word forms that, in their own time, behaved like ordinary nouns. When these names were linked to other words, they often appeared in a belonging to shape, as if the landscape itself was stamped with ownership, family connection, or group identity. Yet just as often, the words fuse together into tight compounds. The kind of names people can shout across a field or carve into memory without thinking about grammar at all. A striking group of names includes those with words like man or men inside them. These are not the kind of names that usually grow out of pretty descriptions of hills and rivers. They sound more like labels for communities, as if the first settlers were known to their neighbours by some collective identity, and the place simply took that identity as its name. When you see names of this kind scattered through early records, it is hard not to picture a settlement defined, less by scenery and more by the people who lived there. Men recognised as a distinct group, a band or a lineage that stood out. To rebuild the story of the settlement period, you cannot rely on a single kind of evidence. You need two different lenses at once. One lens is language, the old names that appear in early documents and the dialect difference that later shaped regional speech. The other lens is people and material life, graves and skeletons, objects and tools, but also habits that lasted for centuries. Some customs, especially rules about who inherits land and how property passes through families, can survive long after politics and borders have changed. They are stubborn, almost like fossils embedded in daily life. In many parts of England, older memories survived as local rivalries. Neighbouring villages could carry a sense of separation that felt tribal, not merely personal. Stories were passed down about contempt between communities only a few miles apart. As if crossing a river or a stretch of moorland meant stepping into foreign territory. Sometimes a stranger from the next valley was treated like an outsider by default, mocked, challenged, even pelted as a symbolic warning. These tales are small, but they hint at something big. Early settlements could be isolated worlds, and a difference in origin could remain socially real for a very long time. If groups of different background lived close to one another, they did not automatically blend. They might keep their own rules, their own ways of settling disputes, their own habits of land holding and kinship. Under ordinary conditions, there was little reason for everyday mixing. Without shared institutions pulling people together, the next community over could remain emotionally distant, even after generations. That lingering distance may explain why some places received names that basically meant the other people, the strange people, the outsiders. The name was not created by the inhabitants themselves, but by those around them, marking them as different. Early England was not built by one neatly defined people. The labels we use today compress a messy reality. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and the rest were umbrellas for many smaller groups. They did not all speak in exactly the same way, and some dialects could have sounded unfamiliar even to close neighbours. When speech differences lined up with different local customs, the boundary between groups would feel sharper. A village could be known not just by where it sat, but by how it spoke, how it inherited, and who it considered kin. Even trade and conflict resolution seem to have followed this pattern of separation. The earliest meeting points were often not inside settlements, but at their edges, on boundary ground. People met at the margins to exchange goods, settle disputes, and negotiate with neighbours, as if the safest place for contact was not the heart of either community, but a strip between them. Over time, many of these border meeting places left their mark in later names that still echo an older function. A spot where outsiders met outsiders under rules that made contact possible. When we talk about the making of the Old English population, we should imagine a blend formed on the ground in Britain, not a single imported package. There were Germanic-speaking settlers of several kinds, and in some areas northern influences left traces that cannot be explained by one source alone. A few small strands may even point to Slavic-speaking groups, absorbed into larger communities but leaving faint fingerprints in settlement patterns, local traditions, or unusual naming forms. Language itself carried layers. Some place names make more sense if you consider Northern speech and Runic tradition, while others fit older Germanic forms, and a small number may resist explanation unless you allow for other influences as well. The landscape also preserves clues beyond words. Some districts show scattered farmsteads that may reflect very old habits of living, while others show tightly clustered villages laid out in patterns that resemble continental settlement designs. In some places you find roads radiating out like spokes from a hub. In others, you see rounded or fan-like clusters around a central space. Shapes that look like they were brought by people who already knew this way of building community life. Village form, like language and custom, can be inherited. One more clue comes from the way people named other people. In later centuries, someone might be called Scot, or Welsh, or Fleming, because neighbours identified them by origin, not because the person invented the label for themselves. That habit of naming outsiders by group identity is old. It helps explain how both personal names and place names could grow from the same instinct to mark who belongs and who does not. A community could become known by the people it was thought to contain, and an individual could carry a name that announced to everyone around him that he came from somewhere else. Some of the oldest personal names that appear in early England look less like random family choices and more like labels of origin. Names such as Goding, Waring, Norman, Eastman, Wendell, and others can be read as echoes of distant homelands or of tribal groups from Northern Europe. In many cases, a name like this makes the most sense as a nickname given by neighbours. Imagine a newcomer arriving in a small settlement where everyone already knows each other. People need a way to identify him quickly. Instead of using a complicated lineage, they call him by what stands out most, where he comes from, or what people group he belongs to. Over time, that label hardens into a personal name, and sometimes it hardens again into a place name. This is why tribal identity matters so much when we read the early map of England. The broad labels we use today, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, can hide the fact that these were umbrellas. Under each umbrella stood many smaller groups, and those groups often carried multiple names depending on who was speaking. A people might call themselves one thing, while their neighbours called them another. In some regions, the same community could be known by an older name in one tradition and a newer name in another. That means a historian searching for tribal traces has to be careful. The same group can appear under different labels, and different groups can be lumped together under a single convenient title. It also means the evidence from names is powerful, but dangerous if handled too confidently. A single surviving tribal-style name does not prove that only one family or one small band was present. For every person whose label survived, there may have been many more from the same background whose names left no mark on the landscape. And even when a name survives, it might not mean what it seems. Place names change because people mishear them, shorten them, joke about them, or reshape them into words that sound familiar. When a name's original meaning fades later, generations often repair it into something they understand, sometimes into an animal name, sometimes into a humorous phrase, sometimes into a completely new sound that feels right in the mouth. This is one reason why early recorded forms matter so much. If you only look at the modern name, you can be tricked. The oldest spellings are like an earlier layer of the map, closer to the moment when the name still made sense to the people who used it. Without that older layer, a modern name can become a mirage, suggesting a meaning that never existed. And there is another complication. Many places once carried more than one name. A settlement might have one name used by neighbours in one direction and a different name used by communities in another. If the surrounding districts spoke different dialects, double naming becomes even more likely. Add the human love of nicknames, and the result is a landscape full of names that are not always straightforward labels, but sometimes jokes, shortcuts, or outsiders' descriptions. Even in the early period, nicknames were not limited to individuals. Communities could acquire them too. A village might be known by an animal-based label because of a founder's nickname, or because neighbours found the sound amusing, or because the old meaning had been forgotten and replaced by something more familiar. This human element matters. A purely mechanical approach to place names, one that treats every name as a tidy linguistic formula, runs into trouble fast because real people reshape language for convenience, for humour, and sometimes simply for variety. Still, the deeper pattern remains. Many early communities were organised around strong kinship ties. A local leader might settle with relatives and close followers, living under a basic family-based order where land, law, and identity were bound to the group. In that kind of world, a place name that seems to carry a tribal label could come from the leader's identity, from the wider band that followed him, or from both at once. A settlement associated with a Wendel name, for example, is hard to explain unless it reflects a person or group identified as Wendish by the people around them. Whether the label attached first to the chief or to the community matters less than the fact that neighbours recognised them as different and named them accordingly. Sometimes the strongest clue is not only a name, but a custom that survived alongside it. Inheritance rules are especially revealing, because they can persist stubbornly through centuries of political change. If a manor follows an unusual inheritance pattern, and that pattern closely matches what we know from a particular region or people group in Europe, it becomes difficult to dismiss the connection as coincidence. Customs can act like fingerprints. They do not tell the whole story, but they suggest who might have been present when the community first formed. This is why the settlement of England should be imagined as a mosaic, not a single colour map. No county shows place names that belong to only one origin. Across the main sea gateways, the great estuaries and river mouths that offered access inland, you find mixed signals, names that point in different directions, hints of different speech traditions, and echoes of more than one kind of newcomer. Over 1,000 years, buildings from different ages remain visible in stone. But tribal habits and family customs are older than architecture, and their survival can reveal early settlement patterns that written narratives never record. If you follow the origins of the early English population back far enough, it does not lead to one source, but to many. The key story is not simply about battles and conquest, but about where people chose to live, how villages were laid out, how neighbours defined one another, and how different groups settled side by side. In some places, one origin may have dominated, while in others the mixture was stronger. Those differences can leave long shadows in local identity, in dialect, and in the stubborn survival of old customs that quietly carry the memory of who first arrived. And this brings us to one of the most misleading words in the whole story: Saxon. We use it as if it were a clear self-chosen identity, but early on it often functioned as an outsider's label. Coastal raiders and seaborne attackers were frequently grouped under one convenient name, especially by the people they threatened. Over time, the label expanded until it could describe many related groups acting together. The reality on the ground was more complex. The newcomers knew themselves by smaller tribal identities, and alliances could shift depending on opportunity, warfare, and migration. Across Northern Europe, confederacies were common. Great names could cover many peoples. A single label might describe a coalition rather than a single tribe. That matters for England because the migration into Britain likely involved coordinated movement by multiple groups, neighbours, allies, and related communities travelling and fighting in overlapping waves. Along the North Sea world, cooperation was practical. Groups living near each other could raid together, migrate together, or settle in sequence, leaving behind a patchwork of identities that later generations merged into larger categories. So when we hear Saxons in the story of early England, we should picture something broader than a single tribe marching under one banner. Think of coastal networks, shifting partnerships, and clustered groups who shared related languages, but not identical ones. Think of smaller communities carrying their own names, their own customs, and their own ways of living, then being grouped under a single label by enemies, by chroniclers, and by later memory. The settlement that followed was not one simple migration, but a layered process, and the evidence still survives. Not just in chronicles, but in the names on the map, the rules families followed, and the quiet boundaries where neighbours once met as strangers. If you follow the trail of early English place names closely, you start to notice something fascinating. Certain clusters of names repeat across the country, like footprints that appear again and again in different landscapes. One of these clusters seems to preserve the memory of a small Saxon group, whose name echoed through the settlements they touched. You see it in places that later became Buckingham, and you see it again in other counties under slightly different spellings. The pattern is hard to ignore. It suggests that settlers carrying the same identifying label were moving, settling, and leaving their mark wherever they established a new home. In a world where outsiders were often named by their neighbours, that label could stick easily. If a man arrived known as Bushi or something close to it, the place built around him might carry that sound forward for centuries. But the story goes deeper than one set of names. Evidence increasingly hints that Germanic-speaking people were not strangers, suddenly appearing at a single dramatic moment. They may have been filtering into Britain earlier, even before the famous waves of invasion described in later tradition. If Germanic soldiers, colonists, traders, or allied fighters were already present in late Roman Britain, the chaos of the 5th century would have made it even easier for more to arrive. Civil conflict weakens borders. Rival leaders seek outside help. And once small groups gain a foothold, larger movements become far more possible. The island may have been opening to newcomers gradually, long before the period when the main settlement story is usually said to begin. When we try to locate the people later called Saxons on the continent, we run into another problem. They did not stay neatly in one place. Ancient writers placed them in regions that later centuries would describe differently, and that alone tells you how mobile these communities could be. Some groups likely shifted south and west over time, while others remained closer to the great rivers and the northern coastlands. And nearby were other populations with names that sound like allies, neighbours, or rivals, groups whose identities overlapped, merged, or split depending on politics and opportunity. The North Sea world was not a set of sealed boxes. It was a living network. Even the word Saxon itself is slippery. It was used early, but not always in a way that proves a single unified people. Sometimes it looks like a label for seafaring raiders, a name outsiders used to describe coastal fighters who struck by ship. Sometimes it points to settled communities along the shore. In reality, both can be true. Raiding and settling often come in sequence. A coastline might first be attacked, then used, then occupied. That pattern is repeated again and again in European history, and it fits the evidence here as well. Across the Channel, there were coastal zones that became associated with people called Saxons long before the main settlement of England. That matters because it suggests something simple but important. Not every Saxon who later crossed into Britain had to come from the far northeast. Some may have come from nearer shores, from communities already living on the continental coast facing Britain. That shortens the distance, and it makes the movement feel less like one dramatic leap and more like a continuation of a long coastal relationship, trade, piracy, migration, and settlement tangled together. Meanwhile, Europe was in motion. Major migrations shook the continent, and when one people moved, others were pushed or pulled in response. If a powerful group migrated south, it could create openings, pressures, and violence in the regions they left behind. Defeats could scatter survivors. Alliances could reshuffle overnight. In such a world, it is easy to imagine displaced fighters and families choosing the sea route into Britain as one more path to survival and land. Settlement is often the shadow cast by war. This is also why early British and English sources can describe waves of newcomers arriving again and again, as if reinforcements were constantly being drawn from across the sea. The invaders were not necessarily a single tribe returning for more. They could be a rotating stream of allied groups, different leaders, different war bands, different backgrounds, gathered under one convenient label. To the people being attacked, they might all look like Saxons. To themselves, they likely had more specific identities. And that brings us to the most important point. For a documentary narrative, the settlers who built early England were not all the same. Even within the regions later called Saxon kingdoms, there are signs of diversity. Local customs varied from one district to the next. Burial evidence varies. Place names vary. Everything about the record suggests mixture. Different groups settling near each other, sometimes blending, sometimes staying separate for generations. One of the clearest hints comes from human remains. The physical evidence from early cemeteries shows a broad range. Not a single uniform type, repeated everywhere. Most individuals fit what you would expect for northern Germanic populations of the time, but a noticeable minority do not match the standard profile. Importantly, similar variation appears in cemeteries across northern Germany itself. That means the differences seen in England do not need to be explained only by mixing with the native Britons. Some of the variation may have been carried in from the start, because the so-called Saxon newcomers were not one perfectly uniform people. They were already a mix of closely related groups, with small but real differences that could reflect separate tribal backgrounds. When you combine all these strands, the picture changes. England was not settled by a single tribe marching in one direction. It was settled by a shifting coalition. Germanic-speaking groups from different zones, arriving in multiple waves, shaped by continental pressures, coastal networks, and local opportunities. Some came as raiders, some as allies, some as colonists, some as families looking for land. Over time, these groups were bundled into big labels, Saxon, Anglo, Jute, because large labels are easier to remember than messy reality. The result was a new population that carried many origins inside it. That is why dialects differed so strongly. That is why local customs could be stubbornly distinct from one valley to the next. That is why the map of England holds so many layers of meaning. If you treat settlement as a mosaic rather than a single story, the evidence stops contradicting itself. It begins to lock together. Repeated place name patterns, early coastal contacts, waves of newcomers from many districts, and the physical variety seen in graves. The early English world was built from many streams, and those streams left their marks in land, language, and memory. The Angles appear in early Roman-era writing as one tribe among many on the northern edge of Europe, linked closely with another people known as the Varangian. Then, for generations, they seem to vanish from the written record. And when they suddenly re-emerge in later English memory, they are no longer described as a small coastal group, but as a force large enough to give its name to most of the land north of the Thames. That jump creates an immediate puzzle. How could a people supposedly rooted in a tiny patch of Schleswig become the dominant name behind England itself? The simplest answer is that the famous homeland called Angeln was never the whole story. It may have been a symbolic core, a frontier zone, or a remembered heartland, but the people identified as Angles likely occupied a wider belt of territory. Their world sat between powerful neighbours, Frisians to the west, Saxon groups to the south, and Slavic-speaking communities along the Baltic to the east. In such a crowded borderland, identities were not sealed off. Alliances formed early, and they could last for centuries. The Angles, in particular, seem to have moved through history alongside a long-term partner. The Warings, the same Varini mentioned by the Roman writers. In later continental law codes, Their names even appear paired, as if the two peoples were meant to be understood together, sharing rules and political habit. Once you accept that, the scale of the migration into Britain becomes easier to explain. If the Anglo expeditions were really a coalition led by a dominant group, then the name could travel farther than the original homeland. That is exactly what later English tradition implies. Early English writers do not describe the settlers as coming from only 3 neatly labelled peoples. They mention a much longer list of northern groups, Frisians, Danes, and others, whose descendants were said to be present in Britain from the beginning. This matters because it pushes Scandinavian involvement earlier than the famous Viking Age. It suggests that people from the Danish world were already part of the settlement stream long before the late 8th century. Another important clue comes from how England itself remembered the origins. In later descriptions of the northern seas, English tradition places the ancestors of the Angles, not only in Schleswig, but also in the Danish islands and in parts of Scandinavia. That tradition fits the sheer size of the Anglian footprint in Britain. It also fits something else. The cultural habits linked to the Angles seem to lean northward. Even the way they reckon the turning of the year appears closer to Scandinavian practice than to the older pattern associated with many Germanic communities farther south. But the most dramatic evidence is not in chronicles. It is carved, scratched, and stamped into objects, messages that survive because they were physically made, not because someone chose to write a history book. These are the early Runic inscriptions found in Britain. The distribution is telling. They appear especially in areas connected with Anglo and Jutish settlement, and they are far less visible in the regions traditionally described as Saxon heartlands. That imbalance matters because it suggests real cultural distance. The groups we call Angles and Jutes carried a writing tradition that the Saxon settlers, at least in their main zones, do not seem to have used in the same way. Runes begin as a northern craft. They are tied to the Gothic world of the Baltic and Scandinavia, and their letter forms show a clear lineage from Mediterranean alphabets. The path is almost cinematic. Shapes inspired by Greek letters travel through contact and trade, are reshaped in the far north, and then cross the sea into Britain with migrating settlers. In England, those northern characters appear on early weapons and personal objects, and later they appear on stone monuments in the north, becoming part of a local tradition of memorial and message. What makes this even more intriguing is that traces of the same early Runic style show up far from Britain as well. On the Baltic coast, in regions tied to Gothic and Vandal movement. In some cases, objects found there can be dated to the same general era as the earliest settlement phase in Britain. That suggests communication across the North Sea and the Baltic was not occasional. It was active. Goods moved, people moved, alliances and trading networks linked communities from Scandinavia to the Baltic coast and into the new settlements in England. And this is where the Angles begin to look less like a small tribe from one little district and more like a label for a wider northern network. Their migration into Britain seems connected to the sea routes of the Baltic and the Scandinavian world. Their allies and companions were not limited to one neighbour. The Angles and Warings appear together so often in the record that they feel like a paired story, and the Warings themselves were deeply tied to long-distance movement, river travel, and trade with the Eastern world. In later centuries, men from those northern backgrounds became famous for serving abroad as elite soldiers in the great imperial city of the East. A reputation that hints at a long tradition of mobility and martial skill. In Britain, the runes become a kind of fingerprint for that northern connection. They show that the early settlers who carried the Anglian name arrived with more than swords and ships. They carried a cultural toolkit, skills, symbols, and habits learned in a northern world shaped by long-distance contact. And in one of history's strangest twists, those northern letters, ultimately descended from Greek forms, arrive in Britain and encounter other Greek-descended letters already present through Roman and Celtic tradition. Two streams of writing born from the same ancient source meet again at the edge of the Atlantic, brought there by different journeys, different empires, and different migrations. So, when you look at the Angles through this lens, the story shifts. They are not simply a small people from a tiny homeland who somehow conquered half an island. They look more like leaders of a larger coalition, tied closely to allies like the Warings, drawing in neighbours from the Danish world and connected to the Baltic networks that carried goods, symbols, and writing across vast distances. Their name becomes not just an ethnic label, but the banner under which multiple northern groups entered Britain, and left behind evidence that still speaks when the chronicles fall silent. The Warings moved through the early medieval world like a living bridge between seas. They were close to the Angles, but their reach stretched far beyond the North Sea. Along the Baltic coast, they were tied to the rise of long-distance trade that connected northern ports to the wealthy cities of the eastern Mediterranean. By the 11th century, a writer in the lands of modern Ukraine describes a major northern city as a Varangian stronghold, which suggests that these traders and warriors were not just visitors there, but a community with real weight. Other northern groups, especially men from the island world of the Baltic, also appear in the same eastern setting. And that matters because it hints at a shared network, not isolated voyages. To understand the Warings, picture the route itself. Goods could travel from the Baltic inland by rivers, then be carried over short land crossings, then pushed onward to new waterways. It was slow, dangerous, and highly organised. People who mastered it became more than merchants. They became power brokers. In some coastal regions, especially those linked to Slavic, pagan strongholds, the Warings show up again, connected to places famous for resisting conversion for an unusually long time. Even their name seems to echo in old river names and coastal towns, as if the coastline itself remembered them. There are also stories that place these northern allies directly inside the political world of early England. One account describes a royal marriage that ties an English ruling house to a Waring king across the Baltic sphere. Whether the details are perfect or not, the direction of the story is clear. The relationship was imagined as real and close enough to be explained through family ties. From that point onward, the Warings become difficult to separate from the wider northern warrior culture that later shocked the Mediterranean world. In the imperial capital of the East, the Warings became famous as an elite guard. They were seen as unusually tall, pale, and imposing, a striking contrast to the populations around them. Over time, their name even became a kind of label for tough foreign fighters who served for pay and honour. And if the Angles were their near partners in the north, it makes sense that they would have shared a similar look and reputation. Even centuries later, some of the regions in England most associated with Anglian settlement are still known for a taller average build, as if an old physical pattern survived beneath the surface of later history. But the story is not only about trade and soldiers, it is also about the dead. Archaeology shows something impossible to ignore. In early England, different funerary customs existed side by side. In some places, people buried their dead. In others, they burned them. And in a number of regions, both practices happened at the same time. That is not a small detail. burial and cremation are not minor variations of the same habit. They reflect different ideas about the body, memory, and the afterlife. When both appear together in the same broad period, it strongly suggests that communities with different traditions were living near each other. One of the great early poems of the English-speaking world even describes a ruler asking for a funeral fire and a mound raised where the sea can see it. That image aligns closely with what archaeologists find in several eastern and northern counties, where cremation appears especially common. The pattern fits a northern style more than a purely Saxon one, and it matches what is known of practices across parts of Denmark and the wider Scandinavian world in the same age. Then comes the next layer, the people later called Jutes. In older northern memory, they rarely appear under a single clear label. Instead, they show up under a cluster of related names, often overlapping with the broader Gothic world. That matters because it suggests the Jutes of English tradition may not have been a neat, isolated nation at all, but part of a wider northern family of groups that shared language, myth, and movement. It also helps explain why later writers reduced the story to 3 peoples. That simplification made the narrative tidy, but it likely erased the real complexity that earlier observers still remembered. Some early English writers list far more source peoples than the famous trio. They speak of groups from the northern coasts and islands, and they place Danes among the ancestors of the settlers long before the well-known Viking raids. Another early British writer uses just one label for all the invaders, calling them all Saxons, not because they were truly one people, but because from the viewpoint of the attacked communities, one name was enough. That tells you more about fear and perspective than about ethnic reality. When you widen the lens, another northern power dominates the background, the Baltic trade machine. No place represents it better than Gotland. For centuries, that island functioned like a northern clearinghouse, where wealth, goods and information flowed in and out. The evidence is not vague. Coins from the Roman world appear there in huge numbers, showing that trade links were active even in the days of the empire. Later, silver from the Islamic world shows up too, proving that Baltic roots reach astonishingly far into the east. This was not a backwater. It was a hub. And that hub mattered for England. Baltic products appear in early English graves, especially amber turned into beads and ornaments. Amber is not just decoration, it is a map. It points toward the coastlands where it was gathered and toward the trade corridors that moved it south and west. Its presence in early England suggests that the sea routes and exchange networks of the Baltic were already touching the new settlements across the North Sea. Even systems of value carry the trace. In parts of England influenced by Scandinavian settlement, people used northern ways of counting wealth alongside older Roman-style measures. These were not always literal coins changing hands. Often they were accounting standards, a language of payment and obligation. But those standards reflect connections, and behind those connections lies the same Baltic world where trade was calibrated through shared units and shared practice. When you put all of this together, the settlement story starts to look less like a simple invasion by 3 nations and more like the movement of a whole northern system. The Warings stand at the centre of that system as traders, river travellers, and later as elite soldiers. The Angles appear not as a tiny tribe from a small district, but as a leading name within a larger coalition. The Jutes blur into the wider Gothic and northern world, and alongside them, Slavic-speaking coastal peoples of the Baltic. often called Wends or Vandals in later memory, repeatedly appear as allies and neighbours. There is even a mythic shadow of that alliance, a northern story of two peoples at war who eventually make peace and exchange hostages. Strip away the gods and you can still see the human outline. Conflict between different cultural worlds, followed by coexistence, intermarriage, and shared expeditions. In England, the echoes of that mixture appear in the map itself, where place names of different northern origins sit near each other, and in old local customs that survived long after the original settlers were forgotten. You can hear the northern migrations in the English language itself. Long before England became one kingdom, waves of people arrived from the Scandinavian world, first in the era of early Anglo and Gothic settlement, and later in the age of Danish expansion. They did not only bring weapons and ships, they brought everyday speech. Over time, the language of these newcomers blended with local tongues and helped shape the accents and dialects that still divide England into recognisable regions. Medieval Scandinavians noticed this connection. One Icelandic scholar wrote that the English used Latin letters in a practical way, matching symbols to sounds, and he used that idea to design a writing system for Icelandic. Another saga casually remarks that people in England, Norway, and Denmark could still understand the same basic language in that period. That claim may sound bold, but it reflects something real. Across the North Sea, speech was close enough that travellers, traders, and warriors could communicate without starting from zero. Even Norman rulers understood the political value of that shared northern speech. There are accounts that a duke wanted his son trained in an older Scandinavian tongue, and he chose a place where the old language still lingered. The detail matters because it shows how long the northern language world remained alive in parts of Western Europe, even after new elites took power and new official languages spread. When you turn to the so-called Jutes, the evidence suggests they were not simply a neat, separate nation in the way later summaries imply. The early Kentish finds linked to Runic writing point toward a people closer to the Anglian or Gothic world than to later Norwegian or Danish identities. Across the Baltic, the Goths were known early, settled along coasts and islands, and their names survived most clearly in places like Gotland and parts of Sweden. In England, echoes of the same northern identity show up in old place name patterns, especially around Kent, Hampshire, and the Isle of Wight, where older wit forms appear like fossils of a much earlier naming habit. This is why the settlement story looks messier the closer you study it. Place names in Kent and elsewhere do not support the idea of a purely Jutish population. Instead, they hint at mixed groups, Gothic-linked settlers, Frisian influences and other coastal peoples moving together, sometimes under one umbrella label, sometimes under another. A later English writer even treats Goths and Jutes as part of the same ancestral line, which fits the wider pattern. The names changed over time, but the people were connected through movement, alliance, and shared culture. If you want a single engine that helps explain how these movements kept happening, look to the Baltic. There was a shipping and trade world there that was already active long before the famous Viking raids. Gotland, with its port of Visby, became a magnet for wealth and a crossroads for routes that reached far inland. The island's ground has produced staggering proof of that trade. Coins from the Roman world, then later streams of silver from the east, showing long-distance exchange over centuries. A place like that does not simply watch history pass. It supplies ships, sailors, and connections. Even if it was not always the main attacker, it could easily have been the carrier, the contractor, the gateway. The evidence also points to direct contact between early England and parts of southern Sweden. There are traditions of English missionaries working among pagan communities there, and there are runic stones in that region that some researchers believed showed signs of English influence. The point for a documentary is simple. The North Sea was not a wall. It was a road. People crossed it often enough that ideas, symbols, and habits could move both ways. Runes are one of the strongest clues. In Scandinavia, runic remains are everywhere. Stones, objects, monuments, so many that they form a kind of archive carved into the landscape. In German lands associated with the Saxons, fixed runic monuments are strikingly rare. In England, early runic writing appears most clearly in areas tied to Anglian and Jutish settlement, especially in the north and in Kent. That uneven pattern matters. It suggests that some of the earliest settlers who shaped certain regions of England were drawn from northern rune-using cultures, while other groups who also settled England did not carry the same habit of public runic inscription. The word Northman itself was never a single tribe. It was a wide label that could include people from many provinces across Sweden and Norway, along with Danes and other coastal groups. In some English regions, traces of those varied origins may survive in old local names and later traditions. And just as Northman was broad, Eastman was broad too, a name that could describe Baltic peoples on the opposite shore from Sweden, tied to trade routes, sea travel, and the flow of goods and silver. Coins add another layer. The earliest English coins found in Norway date from the period when northern raiding and travel began to intensify. That suggests contact through trade, plunder, or both. Over time, the conclusion becomes hard to avoid. The Scandinavian share in England's settlement was larger than older, simplified stories admit. There were early settlers who arrived before the famous Viking Age, and later waves that deepened the northern imprint. Together, they helped shape not only bloodlines and borders, but the very sound of English in different parts of the country. Then, there are the Frisians, often overlooked, yet crucial. Their ancient homeland stretched along the North Sea coast, and it was a landscape that the ocean repeatedly tore apart. Floods swallowed fields, rearranged coastlines, and created new seas and islands. That matters because it hides part of their footprint. A people whose land kept vanishing would naturally spread outward, especially by ship. In their prime, the Frisians were among the great sea peoples of the north. Their trade reached into the Baltic, where they met Goths, Danes, Slavic coastal peoples, and others. They were the kind of maritime power that could supply ships for expeditions, whether as leaders or as the essential transport behind someone else's war. Some early accounts even describe Britain as being occupied by three major peoples, listing Frisians alongside Angles and Britons. Other writers use Saxons as a blanket term for these same invaders, which helps explain how one name could hide several different origins. Frisian settlement patterns also make sense when you think like a coastal navigator. Their power was sea-based. Their movement followed shorelines, and their new communities in Britain often favoured sites that kept sea access close. Over time, their identity blurred into larger confederacies, and their language began to disappear under pressure from stronger neighbours. That slow absorption happened in more than one place. It happened to other famous peoples too. Some vanished so completely that only a regional name survives as their tombstone. Even so, the Frisian trace did not vanish entirely. Their place name habits left patterns behind, and their language survived in pockets through multiple dialects. Certain endings in names point back to them, and some English regions even preserve a pronunciation that echoes the same older habit. Meanwhile, medieval writers still spoke of Frisian nations, hinting that the Frisians were never just one uniform block, but a cluster of related groups, each with its own customs and legal traditions. If you want to measure how much the Frisians mattered in the making of early England, you can do it without digging up a single grave. You can do it by listening to the language. Linguists who compared Old English with Frisian kept running into the same problem. The similarities are too specific to be an accident. It is not just that the two languages share a family tree. They share the same unusual habits, small sound shifts, and spelling patterns that do not show up the same way in other related tongues. That kind of match usually means the changes were already happening before the groups split apart, back in a shared Anglo-Frisian past. Some of the clearest clues are simple everyday words and vowel changes. In Frisian, you can see forms where an older A sound flips into something closer to E, and Old English shows the same odd behaviour in the same kinds of words. You also see how the two languages handle certain vowel pairs in ways that German does not. Even the special terms for major points in the year line up in striking ways. Frisian and Old English share rare seasonal words and build their own common vocabulary for things like the solstice and equinox earlier than their neighbours. When two languages match in that kind of niche vocabulary, it hints at long contact and shared development, not just distant ancestry. Language is only one trail, though. The Frisians were not a single uniform block. They were a coastline of related peoples who could be called Frisians in one source, and then named by smaller tribal identities in another. Some groups had their own reputations and their own territories, and certain names tied to rivers and regions in the Low Countries still preserve those old labels. One of these groups appears in early English tradition under a name that sounds like Huni. The same name turns up in northern songs and legends, and it leaves a wide footprint across the North Sea world, attached to districts, waterways, and local memory. That name carries another kind of evidence: folklore and landscape. Across parts of northern Germany and the Netherlands, old burial mounds and stone graves were often labelled as giant places in local tradition, using words built from that same root. The language of legend does not prove ethnicity by itself, but it does show that the label was ancient, widespread, and strongly anchored in the regions tied to Frisian life. It also hints that Frisian could mean a coalition, with different layers of people living side by side, some fair, some darker, some older in the region than others. Another major partner in this coastal world was the Chauci, a large people who lived between the Weser and the Elbe. They were closely connected to the Frisians and appear in Roman-era descriptions as a serious power along the coast. Later, their name fades, likely swallowed by larger political unions, but traces of it survive in place names on the continent. What matters for England is that coastal groups like this had both motive and means to cross the sea. They had ships, they had experience, and they lived in lands where floods, storms, and limited farmland could make overseas settlement look like opportunity, rather than exile. Archaeology adds texture to this picture. Certain types of burial containers found near the old coastal homelands also appear in scattered parts of England, including regions far from the usual Anglo versus Saxon story. You do not get that kind of distribution unless people moved, and moved in numbers. Even if you ignore heroic legends and later chronicles, the objects quietly suggest the same thing. Multiple coastal groups took part. not just one neatly labelled nation. The Roman writers who describe the Frisian coast paint a harsh world, low land, water everywhere, homes raised on mounds, peat and mud used as fuel, rainwater collected for drinking. It is a brutal setting if you are trying to raise families and build stability. From that kind of environment, migration is not a mystery. It becomes a survival strategy. And Britain was close, only a short sail away. If a strong group could secure a foothold, the rewards would be enormous compared to the struggle of living at the mercy of the sea. There is also the religious bridge, which tells you something about kinship. Centuries after Frisian settlers had already blended into England, the remaining Frisians across the sea were still pagan. Missionaries from the Frankish world struggled, but missionaries from England had an advantage. They sounded more familiar. They spoke closer dialects, shared cultural habits, and carried a sense that they were dealing with cousins across the water. When you read the record of those missions, you are not just seeing religion spread. You are seeing the shadow of an older migration and a shared origin. Small finds strengthen the same point. Objects discovered in the Low Countries have been linked to early English-style Runic writing, suggesting contact moving both ways: trade, return journeys, skilled metalworkers, or people travelling between settlements and homelands. It is the kind of evidence you expect if the North Sea is functioning as a corridor, not a border. And then there is naming, one of the most underrated forces in early history. In a world of small communities, people were often identified by who they were: their group, their clan, their origin. If someone from a particular tribe settled among outsiders, the easiest label was the tribal name itself. Over time, those labels could turn into personal names, and personal names could become place names when a farm or village took the name of its leading family. That is how the map can become a memory bank. When you later find repeated personal names built from the same tribal roots in early English records, it suggests that the people behind those names were not a handful of strangers. They were present in enough numbers for long enough to leave marks in everyday naming. Even physical anthropology was dragged into the debate by older scholars who compared skulls from continental sites with early English remains and argued for a strong Frisian connection. Modern genetics and methods have changed how we talk about these questions, but the older observation still fits the larger pattern. The Frisian element in the early English population was not minor. It was deep, repeated, and sustained. Along the southern shore of the Baltic and east of the river Elbe lived communities that the German-speaking world grouped under one broad label: the Wends. Roman-era writers already knew them by closely related names and described them as a major presence along that coastline. Long before the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms took shape in Britain, these Slavic peoples were established in the regions we now associate with Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and the lands reaching inland toward the great river routes of Central Europe. They were not a single uniform nation. They were a patchwork of tribes with their own rivalries and alliances, sometimes fighting on opposite sides of the same continental power struggle. Some allied with Saxon neighbours, others leaned toward the rising Frankish world. And those political choices mattered because the Baltic was not a quiet backwater. It was a highway. Whoever controlled the ports, the shipyards, and the coastal trading lanes could influence movements of people as much as movements of goods. One of the reasons the Wends became tangled in debates about early Vandals is that names shifted across centuries, and outsiders often reused older labels for newer realities. Earlier writers sometimes treated Vandal like a wide umbrella term. while later medieval sources clearly describe the Baltic coast east of the Elbe as Slavic-speaking territory. If you look at the region in the early Middle Ages, the most stubborn evidence is not a king list or a heroic saga, but the ground itself. The oldest local place names in those districts are overwhelmingly Slavic in form. When later German expansion pushed eastward, it did not uncover pockets of earlier German-speaking villagers still clinging to the land. Instead, it met a deep, continuous Slavic layer. That makes the simplest reading hard to escape. The dominant population east of the Elbe during the relevant centuries was Slavic, even if older authors had once used broader labels that blurred the picture. Among the Wendish groups, the Varangians stand out because they are tied to a very specific landscape. The island, now called Rügen. In the medieval imagination, it was more than an island. It was a spiritual centre. Its most famous sanctuary, on the northern headland, was described as a shrine that drew tribute and pilgrims from far across Slavic lands. Archaeological and historical traditions link the island's religious identity to Slavic practice rather than Germanic cults, which makes it a powerful clue when early English writers list Varangians among the ancestral streams that fed into the peoples of England. That is where the English story begins to widen. The traditional narrative treats the making of early England as a mostly Germanic affair, but there are small stubborn signs that a Slavic element may have entered the mix. One possible pathway is surprisingly early. A Roman-era relocation of defeated groups from the Rhine frontier into Britain. The sources say that after a major defeat, thousands of outsiders were transported to the island and settled under imperial control. If even a portion of those settlers were drawn from Slavic-linked communities known to Roman writers by Wendish-style names, then Britain contained a Slavic thread centuries before the better-known migrations from the North Sea coast. Over time, those settlers could have blended into local populations, survived as distinct communities for a while, and then merged again when later waves of newcomers arrived. A second pathway is more gradual and more believable: alliance travel. The Saxons on the western side of the Elbe and Wendish peoples on the eastern side lived within striking distance of each other. Peace and cooperation would have been necessary for coastal fleets to gather, trade networks to function, and expeditions to launch. If ships were being built, crews gathered, and routes planned along the lower rivers and the Baltic edge, it would be strange if the movement involved only one side of the river forever. Even small groups joining larger expeditions would be enough to leave a faint but real mark. And the mark may be visible in names. Old English records preserve clusters of place names and personal names that look like echoes of Wendish tribal labels, especially those linked to the Varangians and to another powerful group often associated with the wolf name in Slavic tradition. The argument is not that whole English counties suddenly became Slavic-speaking. It is that pockets of settlers, families, war bands, merchant crews, or allied contingents could settle among larger Germanic populations and be remembered in local naming. In early medieval life, a village name could preserve the identity of a founding family for centuries after the family's original language had vanished. There is also a later Baltic connection that makes the idea of Slavic presence in England less surprising. Along the Wendish coast, a major port rose to fame as a commercial giant, famous enough to be described as one of the great marketplaces of Europe. It competed with the leading Scandinavian trading centres and sat directly on the routes that moved silver, weapons, slaves, luxury goods, and coinage across the Baltic world. In that environment, alliances were practical. Wendish and Scandinavian forces sometimes cooperated, and later, medieval tradition even records Slavic contingents, serving alongside Danish rulers. If Danes could bring allies from the Baltic shore into their campaigns, then Slavic settlers arriving in England in the Viking Age becomes a realistic scenario rather than a fantasy. None of this requires the Wends to have looked the same everywhere either. Slavic populations across Europe have always shown variety in complexion and appearance, and the surviving Slavic communities in parts of Germany were often described as darker than their neighbours. That does not prove what the Baltic Wends looked like in every district, but it does remind us that Slav was not a single physical type, and the Baltic coast likely held mixtures shaped by centuries of contact, trade, and intermarriage. Along the Baltic shoreline, especially in the long sweep toward the Vistula and beyond, Europe's early map was constantly being redrawn. This coast worked like a pressure zone where peoples gathered, splintered, and moved again. Before the Roman world collapsed, Goths were already established east of the Vistula. Around the headwaters of the Vistula and the Oder, other groups associated with the old Vandal label occupied wide territory. By the 5th century, you can picture the interior river corridors filling with new arrivals, including Burgundians along the mid-runs of those rivers, while Slavic communities tied to names like the Rugians held key stretches of the Baltic coast near the Oder. Even the name Rugian seems to have shifted over time, sometimes used narrowly for an island and a coastline, and sometimes used more broadly, almost like a regional label that later writers linked to tribes who appear under different names in later centuries. In the northern stories written down in Scandinavia, the Wendish coast is remembered as a single large frontier zone. Vindland is the word used for the stretch of territory running from the German coastlands eastward toward what we would now call the Baltic borderlands. What matters here is not the label itself, but what it implies. The Wends were not landlocked villagers cut off from the sea. They were sailors, raiders, traders, and mercenaries in the same violent maritime world as the Danes and the Norwegians. By the 10th century, the sources describe Danish and Wendish, sea warriors, serving in the same political orbit, and they even mention the practical detail you would expect in that kind of contact. Interpreters who could translate the Wendish language. That single detail tells you everything. These were not occasional strangers. They were close enough, often enough, that translation became a routine necessity. The story tightens further when politics turns into family. A marriage linked the Danish royal house with a Wendish royal line, turning alliance into blood. And then comes a surprising fact that changes how you should picture the North Sea Empire of Knut. His power was not only anchored in England and Denmark, he also held authority over parts of the Baltic Wendish world. That matters because it turns migration into administration. If a king controls both shores of the sea lanes, people move with him: warriors, household troops, officials, shipmen, and the followers who always gather around power. When Knut built and maintained his professional military household in England, some of those men were tied to the Baltic seafaring networks that included the famous warrior brotherhood associated with the Wendish coast. Even exile and banishment could feed this movement because expelled fighters needed a new lord, and England under a sea empire king was the obvious destination. On the ground in England, the traces are small but sharp. Early documents preserve place names that seem to carry the ethnic label itself, as if communities once said, "This is where the Fens settled," and the name stuck. Over centuries, the language changes, the spelling shifts, but the core sound survives in village names and landscape markers. You see the same kind of survival across northern Germany too, where many Slavic names endured even after the language faded. It is not proof of mass settlement, but it is exactly what you would expect from scattered colonies that were absorbed while leaving local labels behind. Customs may tell the same story in a different way. In parts of England, one old inheritance habit appears that is far more common in Slavic legal tradition than in classic Germanic practice. The youngest son inherits the holding. That pattern is strongly associated with Slavic rural society in many regions of Europe. It also lingered in zones along the Baltic trade routes, where Wendish commerce later concentrated. A custom like that can survive long after ancestry is forgotten, because families keep doing what works, and village memory can be stronger than written law. There are also moments where the sources briefly spotlight individuals who look like they belong to the Baltic frontier world. A few names that appear alongside powerful English figures in royal documents seem to carry a non-English, non-Scandinavian flavour. The kind of thing you might expect if men from the Slavic coast were present in a king's circle. Add to this the record of a prominent Wendish prince who entered Knut's service, spent time in England, and even married into the dynasty. That is not a rumour of distant contact. That is a personal bridge between the Baltic Slavs and the English court. And then there is the evidence of objects, the kind of evidence that refuses to be explained away as a copyist's mistake. A very early gold ring found on the Pomeranian coast carried runic characters that match the style used in England. Its design blended pagan symbols with motifs that hint at the religious world changing at the time. Alongside it were Roman gold coins from late imperial emperors, which anchors the deposit to the 5th century. That is centuries before the later German expansion into those regions, and long before medieval merchants could explain everything. The simplest explanation is also the most human. A warrior or trader acquired a prestigious English-made ornament, carried it across the sea, and lost it. Or it was given as a gift to a local leader as payment, alliance, or status. Either way, it shows that England and the southern Baltic were in contact extremely early, and that contact could move people, not just goods. From there, the documentary thread becomes clear. Wendish influence in England is not a single event, it is a sequence. First, there are hints of earlier movements under Roman authority, when defeated groups were relocated into Britain. Then come the migration waves of the early medieval period, when alliance and opportunism carried small numbers of Baltic Slavs into the same fleets and settlements as Saxons, Angles, and Jutes. Finally, the Danish age, especially under Knut, creates a political structure that makes movement across the North Sea and Baltic not only possible, but normal. That wider background also helps explain a question that has bothered observers for a long time. Why are certain English counties noticeably darker in hair and eye colour than surrounding regions? The usual explanation is that more of the native British population survived there and mixed with incoming settlers. That may be part of the truth, but it is not the only possible path. Some Slavic groups in northern Germany were described as darker than their Germanic neighbours, and a few coastal districts of Norway also contained communities that were darker and broader-headed than the typical Scandinavian type. If English settlement was shaped not by one pure people, but by coalition fleets and mixed war bands, then darker newcomers arriving alongside Danes, Norwegians, and other allies become a realistic possibility. Local names may even preserve how people noticed these differences. Brown, as a personal label, makes sense only if the colour stood out. In early communities, people were often nicknamed by appearance, and those nicknames could become family names and then place names. That is why Old English names built from words meaning brown or dark can matter. They may reflect how neighbours described a person or a group and then used that description to label a settlement. Over time, later generations often reinterpreted those words as landscape terms, like streams or hills, because the original human meaning had faded. But the earlier logic remains. Many names that look like geography might have begun as people. Across Northern Europe, there has always been more than one look, more than one physical type living side by side. If you travel to the southeast of Norway or into the low, flat backlands behind the old Frisian coast, you still find pockets of people who stand out from their neighbours. They tend to be darker in hair and complexion, and in some districts their head shape and build also differ from the long-faced, fair-haired coastal types that many people instinctively associate with the north. The important point is simple. Darker communities did not exist only in the far south of Europe. They survived in the north itself, and they survived in places directly connected to the sea routes that fed early migration into Britain. That matters when we talk about the making of early England. If darker people were clearly present in Norway, and if darker people were present in the regions behind Friesland, then it becomes hard to imagine that every ship that crossed into Britain carried only the fair-haired version of the northern world. Migration does not work like selective casting. People leave for the same reasons everywhere: pressure on land, trouble at home, opportunities abroad, the pull of leaders, the push of conflict. If Frisians moved in large numbers, then some of the darker populations living in the same wider zone could easily have moved with them. The same logic applies to the Slavic coastlands, known in German tradition as Wendish country. Some Wendish groups, and the descendants of those groups, were noticeably darker than the surrounding Germanic populations. If Wends settled in England in meaningful numbers, it would be strange to assume that none of them belonged to that darker type. In the Low Countries there is another clue. Behind the famous Frisian coast, there are inland areas where a different-looking population persisted for a long time. They stand out not only in colour but in shape and build, forming a visible contrast with their Frisian neighbours. Old legal texts even hint that outsiders from specific districts were treated as a distinct category, as if people recognised that these men are not quite the same as the rest. That kind of social distinction usually reflects something real on the ground. A separate origin, a separate identity, or at least a reputation strong enough to become policy. Once you widen the lens, a bigger pattern appears. Across Central and Eastern Europe there existed an ancient, broad-headed, darker complexioned population that left traces in many regions, even where languages and identities later changed. Many scholars connected the early Slavic peoples to this older stock, not because every Slavic group looked the same, but because the overall pattern in the East leaned that way compared to the classic, long-headed, lighter type, often associated with northern Germanic groups. This creates a strange but fascinating convergence when you think about Britain. If some darker traits in England came from older native populations, and if other darker traits arrived later with migrants from the North Sea and Baltic world, then different routes could lead to a similar result. The appearance might overlap even when the story behind it is not identical. Then the evidence becomes more personal and local because names start to speak. In early England, people were often labelled by what others noticed first: hair colour, skin tone, or a striking feature. That habit leaves footprints in personal names and in place names. You can see it in the repeated appearance of names, built from words meaning black or dark, turning up not once or twice, but again and again in records. The same happens on the map. Settlements carry names that look like they began as descriptions of people, rather than descriptions of landscape. Some of these places sit right on the coast, which is an important detail because coastal names often point to arrivals by sea. A settlement near the shoreline named for dark men sounds less like a quiet survival of an older inland population, and more like a community marked by newcomers who looked different enough to be nicknamed. What makes this even more compelling is that early English sources do not usually describe the native Britons as brown or black as an ethnic label. When they speak about the Britons, they use other categories, other words, other boundaries. Yet Irish and Welsh records sometimes describe raiders as black and contrast them with fair groups. That suggests that black in these accounts was not a poetic flourish for everyone, but a real visual contrast, people who stood out even to communities already familiar with many kinds of outsiders. In Ireland, the records repeatedly speak about two rival groups of sea raiders, one described as dark, the other as fair. They fight each other, they seize ports, they struggle for control, and their leaders are named. That tells us that the dark label mattered enough to function as a category, not just an insult. In Wales, there is a chilling entry about a leader arriving with dark men, raiding an island, and carrying off thousands of captives, followed by another entry describing the ransom paid to get the prisoners back. When you place those notices beside Scandinavian stories about rulers operating out of Wendish territory, launching raids along the coasts and moving between the Baltic and the British Isles, the picture that forms is hard to ignore. Mixed fleets, mixed alliances, mixed crews, including men from the Wendish world. And there is one more route that is rarely considered in popular retellings. Not every person on a longship was a free warrior. Some were enslaved. Northern raiders took captives, traded them, and carried them across seas. A darker captive population from the far north, even from Arctic borderlands, could have been dragged into this world and carried into Britain against their will. That does not explain everything, but it reminds you how complex a migration can be. It can include settlers, soldiers, mercenaries, traders, prisoners, and household dependents, all moving under the same political storms. Put all of this together and the old, neat story begins to blur. The making of England cannot be reduced to three clean labels as if Anglo-Saxons and Jutes were a single uniform crowd. Those names often worked like umbrella terms, covering alliances and coalitions that shifted over generations. Even the grave evidence points in that direction. Most burials match the expected Northern European patterns, but a minority stand apart in head shape and physical type. The easiest explanation has always been to call these differences surviving natives, but the timeline makes that too simple. Between the Bronze Age and the early medieval settlement lies the entire Roman period, with soldiers and settlers arriving from many provinces. By the time the North Sea migrations began in earnest, Britain had already been mixed for centuries. The Danish presence in England did not begin with the famous Viking Age. Long before the great raids made headlines in chronicles, small groups from the Danish world were already appearing on the map. Early English writers used several labels for them, sometimes simply calling them Danes, sometimes using older poetic names, and sometimes naming them after the regions and islands they came from. Over time, these visitors stopped being occasional strangers and became permanent neighbours, because the movement never really ended. It started early, then surged again and again after the 8th century, until whole districts of England carried a Scandinavian stamp. One of the strongest clues is hidden in place names. You see early English locations whose names literally point to Danish people or Danish families living there. A stream, a clearing, a settlement, even an entire administrative district could carry a name that effectively says, Danes were here. Some woodlands were remembered the same way. A forest could become the Danish wood in local memory, the kind of label that usually appears only when a group has been visible long enough to shape how a landscape is talked about. But Dane in England often meant more than a modern passport would. In early medieval terms, it could function as a broad umbrella for Scandinavians in general. The language spoken across the northern seas was close enough, and the maritime world was connected enough, that English observers could fold many groups into a single category. That matters because the Baltic was not divided into neat, isolated peoples. It was a coastline of mixed ports, alliances, rivalries, and shared expeditions. When Danish power grew, Denmark became the natural command centre for coalitions sailing west. In war, in trade, and in colonisation, a Danish-led fleet could easily include partners from other shores. You can watch that wider Baltic world forming in the background. Scandinavians had reached the eastern Baltic early, leaving traces in burials, in island names, and in coastal settlements. And they were not alone out there. Slavic-speaking communities held the southern coast, and contact between Danes and these neighbours could be friendly or hostile, depending on the decade. The sea produced raiders, merchants and mercenaries on every shore. It also produced interpreters, which tells you something important. People were cooperating across language barriers, not merely fighting. Once a region needs translators on a regular basis, it means the traffic is constant. This is where England's story becomes bigger than the usual Danes versus Anglo-Saxons framing. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, Denmark's kings were not just regional warlords. Through dynastic marriages and political expansion, they built ties that stretched into the Wendish lands along the southern Baltic. Under rulers like Knut, that connection tightened even further. If a king effectively held influence on both sides of the sea, then movement into England would not be limited to people born in the Danish heartlands. Soldiers, retainers, traders, and exiles from allied territories could arrive under Danish banners and settle in Danish-controlled zones. At the same time, the northern stories that survived in England were deeply Scandinavian in spirit. The world of heroic poetry, feasting halls, sea kings, and blood feuds feels at home in a Scandinavian setting. That matters because it hints at cultural transfer, not just military pressure. If the early English literary tradition preserves tales set among Danes and centred on Danish courts, it suggests that Scandinavian influence was not a thin surface layer. It was present in the memory, the storytelling, and the identity of parts of early England. And then there is the question of other Baltic peoples joining the flow. Look east across the sea and you find Finnic-speaking communities in close contact with Sweden. And further south you find Estonian and Livonian regions with their own maritime life. These areas were not sealed off. They traded, fought, and interacted with Scandinavians for centuries. When Swedish groups pushed into Eastern Europe and helped form new political structures there, They did it with networks that linked the Baltic coasts together. Coins travelling back and forth are one of the clearest signs of this. When English coins are found far away on the eastern side of the Baltic world, it is not a fantasy of distant contact. It is a footprint of real movement, real exchange, and real routes that connected England to places most people today would never associate with early English history. If people from those eastern shores did end up in England, they would not have arrived as a separate, clearly labelled migration. They would have been absorbed into the larger Scandinavian presence. Names hint at this kind of absorption. Some individuals in records appear with names that look like they could preserve a distant origin, while still living inside a Danish-dominated social world. Over a few generations, language and identity would smooth out the edges. That is how colonization usually works. Small groups vanish into the larger majority, leaving only faint traces in local names, family traditions, and a handful of unusual details. Even physical anthropology enters the discussion, not as a dramatic claim, but as a reminder that early England was not built from one uniform type. A small minority of skeletal remains from early medieval graves show facial shapes that do not fit the classic North Sea stereotype. That does not prove direct migration from any single region, and it should never be treated like a simple equation. But it does fit the larger pattern. England's settlers came through networks that reached far beyond the narrow list of familiar tribes. The Baltic world was a corridor, and corridors bring variety. Cultural parallels are another kind of clue. Baltic peoples shared rituals and seasonal customs with Germanic and Scandinavian neighbours. Reverence for springs and wells, sacred groves, midsummer fires, and the stubborn survival of old practices, even after conversion. England preserved the same kind of habits. Wells that once belonged to older belief systems were later given Christian names rather than erased, because the attachment was too deep to break. That is exactly what you would expect in a world where old and new beliefs overlapped for generations. And some of the most haunting evidence of shared imagination appears in Midsummer legend. In the far north, where twilight can stretch into dawn and night never fully settles, people built stories to explain the glowing sky itself. One tale describes two figures who meet in the brief heart of summer, passing the light from one to the other, their reunion painting the horizon with colour. It is a poetic way of describing the northern summer, dawn and dusk, almost touching. And it reveals how strongly seasonal experience shaped belief. When you find midsummer traditions thriving across Scandinavia, the eastern Baltic and the British Isles, it points to a common northern rhythm that travelled with people as much as with ideas. Early English records sometimes use broad labels like Eastmen or Esterlings for people arriving from the eastern side of the sea world. But every so often the evidence becomes sharper, almost like a fingerprint. A handful of place names in England seem to preserve the memory of specific Baltic groups, not just a vague, from the east, identity. Names tied to Osgothi, for example, look like they are pointing toward Gothic people from the Baltic sphere, communities linked to the eastern shores of Sweden or the regions beyond the Vistula, where Gothic traditions once had deep roots. In Scandinavia itself, the old Gothic world did not disappear overnight. There were pockets of people in more isolated districts who kept older speech habits and older ways of life longer than most. Linguists have long noticed that certain sounds and pronunciations survived in these northern corners in a way that echoes early English and Icelandic patterns. When England was receiving settlers and warriors from the north, those arrivals were rarely neat, single-tribe migrations. Coalitions formed, ships sailed together, and groups blended. So if we want to spot Swedes, Goths, or other Baltic peoples in England, we often have to look sideways at names, at clusters of settlements, and at the quiet hints left behind when identity fades into a bigger label. Swedes, for instance, are not always named directly in English narrative sources, but Scandinavian Runic memorials in Sweden tell a different story. They speak of men who went to England and never returned, families who raised stones because that was the last proof their relatives existed at all, and even settlers who built lives across the sea. Those inscriptions turn maybe into certain. People from Sweden were part of the movement that reshaped England. Back in England, the traces feel smaller, but they are still there. Old names built around forms like Swion, Sver, or Swine, scattered through different counties like faint coastal debris after a long tide. And the pattern matters. You would expect these names to appear where Scandinavian settlement was strongest, where Danish or Norse influence had already opened the door. It's the same logic you see in any migration story. People don't land alone. They arrive through routes already proven safe by earlier travellers. Other Baltic groups may have moved the same way. The Burgundians are a good example. They appear in early northern geography linked with the island we now call Bornholm, and they were close in ancestry and culture to northern Gothic peoples. There is also older imperial history claiming that Burgundian groups were transported into Britain in Roman times, which opens another door. Not all northern bloodlines arrived in the 5th century or the Viking era. Some could have been planted earlier, then later mixed into the waves of newcomers. England was not sealed off during Roman rule. It was a province plugged into a huge transport network. But the story gets even more interesting when you stop focusing only on names and start watching customs. Because customs are stubborn. Laws can change, rulers can fall, languages can blend, but family habits, especially inheritance, can survive like fossils in living communities. Medieval legal writers noticed it themselves. England, compared to many places, was unusually shaped by local tradition. The rules of who inherits what were not always decided by a single national blueprint. They could change from town to town, manor to manor, sometimes surviving for centuries, even when the wider country moved in another direction. The strangest and most revealing example is the youngest son inheritance tradition. In many places, you would expect the firstborn son to take everything, or at least to take the main share. Yet in a surprising number of English towns and manors, the opposite rule lived on. The youngest son inherited the house or even the whole holding. This wasn't a small, isolated quirk. It appeared across wide parts of England, especially in certain clusters, and it survived deep into later centuries, long after social pressure was pushing hard toward elder right. That kind of survival almost never happens by accident. A rule like that does not pop up independently in dozens of places like mushrooms after rain. It behaves like a carried tradition, something brought by people who believed it was the correct way to keep a household stable. When you widen the lens to the continent, you find similar youngest son customs in scattered districts across parts of northern France, the Low Countries, and especially in parts of Germany where older Slavic influence had once been strong. In some Frisian regions, there was even a system where a family allotment could not be divided at all. And when the father died, the entire share went to the youngest son. If that youngest line ended, the land could even return to the community. That is not the mindset of a society obsessed with dividing property evenly. It is the mindset of a society trying to keep a single working unit intact. What stands out is where this youngest son pattern shows up in Europe. It is not strongest in the old heartlands of classic Germanic law, where equal division among sons was an early norm. Instead, it appears repeatedly in areas touched by Slavic settlement, or close contact, borderlands, mixed zones, regions shaped by migration and fusion. And that lines up eerily well with the broader picture the place names and coin finds are already suggesting. England did not receive settlers from only 3 neat tribes. It received people from a whole Baltic world of alliances, some Germanic, some Scandinavian, some Slavic, adjacent, some mixed. And over generations those identities blurred into what later writers simply called English. Early law codes from Eastern Europe give us a valuable mirror for understanding how inheritance and social order worked long before written law dominated daily life in England. One of the earliest of these codes, created in medieval Russia, shows a society that relied on ideas familiar across early Europe: trial by ordeal, compensation for injury, and communal responsibility. What stands out most is what it does not contain. The idea that the eldest son should automatically inherit everything simply did not belong to the early Slavic world. That principle arrived much later and even then failed to take root. When rulers tried to impose it, it clashed with long-standing habits and was quietly undone or softened. This tells us something important. Inheritance customs were not abstract rules, but reflections of how people actually lived. Slavic society was deeply agricultural and cooperative. Villages functioned as shared communities, where land was worked collectively and family survival mattered more than individual dominance. Within this system, the youngest son often stayed at home the longest, caring for parents and maintaining the household. Giving him preference in inheritance was practical, not ideological. This village-based system survived for centuries because it worked. When we look at England, we find striking echoes of the same pattern in places where the youngest son inherited the family holding. These customs did not appear randomly. They point back to older communal traditions carried westward from regions east of Germany, where Slavic influence had once been strong. In southern England, especially in counties like Sussex and parts of Hampshire, the survival of youngest son inheritance alongside place names that resemble old communal terms suggests more than coincidence. These areas preserve traces of a very old way of organising rural life. The evidence does not demand that every such place was settled directly by Slavs, but it strongly suggests that people shaped by Slavic-influenced traditions were among the settlers. Customs of this kind are remarkably durable. Once embedded in farming communities, they tend to outlive political change, religious conversion, and even shifts in language. When we turn from youngest son inheritance to eldest son preference, the map changes. In northern England, in Scotland, on the Isle of Man, and in regions shaped by Norse settlement, the eldest child, usually the son, held priority. If there were no sons, the eldest daughter could inherit. This pattern appears again and again in places connected to Norwegian settlement. Normandy, before the conquest, followed the same rule, which makes sense when we remember that the Normans themselves came from Scandinavia. These customs were not imposed by feudal law at first. They were already there, part of rural life long before kings and lawyers turned them into rigid systems. What makes this especially revealing is that the eldest daughter rule survives in a few isolated English manors. This is not feudal primogeniture in its strict form. It is something older and more flexible, possibly rooted in even earlier traditions where inheritance could pass through women. In parts of Central Europe, similar customs still exist, and they are often linked to ancient populations that predate later Germanic dominance. Norway itself shows traces of such older groups, suggesting that some Norwegian inheritance customs may have preserved fragments of a much deeper past. After the Norman conquest, the landscape changed. Norman rulers favoured strict primogeniture because it strengthened feudal control and prevented estates from being broken up. Wherever they could, they enforced it. Yet even under this pressure, older customs survived in pockets. In places like Cumberland, the rule allowing the eldest daughter to inherit, when there were no sons, endured for centuries. That kind of survival only happens when a custom is deeply rooted in local identity. Alongside eldest son and youngest son systems, there was a third major pattern: partable inheritance, where property was divided among children. This was common among many Germanic peoples, and especially strong among the Frisians. In these communities, fairness meant sharing. In some regions, both sons and daughters inherited equally. In others, daughters inherited only if there were no sons. England preserves many versions of this system, most famously in Kent, where land was divided, but the youngest son often retained the family house, compensating his siblings. This hybrid system reflects compromise between different traditions meeting in the same place. These three systems, youngest son inheritance, eldest child preference, and shared inheritance, are not random variations. They are living evidence of migration. Each system points back to a different region of Europe and a different way of organising family life. England did not receive a single people with a single law. It received many groups, each carrying their own assumptions about fairness, family, and land. Early Germanic societies did not rely on written wills. Property passed according to custom, not personal choice. That habit continued in England for centuries. Only in a few places could ordinary landholders freely leave their property by will, and those places preserved a privilege inherited from very early times. Most people depended on manorial custom, which itself was shaped by ancient tribal practice. The fact that Parliament had to intervene in the 16th century to allow widespread testamentary freedom shows how deeply rooted these older systems were. All of this fits into a larger picture of early English society. Communities were built around family groups. Responsibility for law and order rested not on distant authority, but on kinship. Families answered for their members. They paid fines together, defended each other, and shared both guilt and compensation. Settlements were therefore not random clusters of houses, but organised groups of related people. Over time, these kin-based units merged into larger districts, eventually becoming hundreds and shires. But the foundation remained local. Even the justice system reflects this world. Freemen relied on oaths backed by their kin. Those without kin or without free status had to submit to ordeal. After conversion to Christianity, these ordeals were wrapped in religious ritual, carried out inside churches, lending divine authority to ancient practices. The system was harsh, but it was consistent with a society where law, belief, and community were inseparable. Picture a small church filled with silence and heat. The community is gathered, but not as a crowd. Only a limited number of witnesses are allowed close enough to see what happens. The goal is control, not spectacle. The accusation is serious, and everyone knows the outcome could end a life. The priest prepares the ritual as if it were a sacred service, because by this point, justice has been pulled into the space of religion, dressed in prayers and solemn routine. A heavy iron bar is placed into the coals and left there long enough to glow and burn. its weight is not random. A lesser charge might demand a lighter piece of iron, a greater charge something heavier. When the time comes, the iron is lifted out and set on a stone surface where everyone can see it. The accused steps forward. There is no argument, no debate, no lawyer's speech. In this world, innocence is not proven by evidence in the modern sense. It is proven by surviving a test that is meant to reveal the truth through pain. The person must seize the hot iron with a bare hand. Then he must walk a measured distance, taking a set number of steps along a marked line before throwing the iron down. The rules are strict because the ritual depends on uniformity. If anything changes, people can claim the test was unfair. The movements are simple, almost mechanical, but that is exactly what makes the moment terrifying. The entire scene is designed to feel older than any written law, like something pulled straight from tribal life and only later wrapped in Christian ceremony. Once the iron is dropped, the real judgment is delayed. The hand is wrapped immediately, sealed, and left untouched for days. This delay creates tension, because the verdict is no longer in the moment of pain, but in what happens afterward. When the bandage is finally removed, the wound becomes the evidence. If it looks clean and healing, the accused is declared innocent. If it looks infected and ruined, guilt is assumed. The community accepts this not because it is medically sensible, but because it fits their belief that divine justice will show itself on the body. But here is the crucial detail. A free person did not always have to face the iron. Freedom came with a shield, and that shield was family. If a man had strong relatives, they could stand beside him and swear that they believed he was innocent. Their oath did not claim they witnessed the event. It claimed they trusted his word. And in early society, trust backed by blood was treated as proof. This is why kinship mattered more than almost anything else. Family was not just emotional, it was legal insurance. Early Anglo-Saxon life was built on that bond. A man belonged to two lines of relatives, one through his father and one through his mother. Both lines carried responsibilities, but not equally. In some regions, if a man committed a crime, most of the compensation owed would be paid by his father's side, while his mother's side carried a smaller share. That split tells you everything about how identity worked. A person was not an isolated individual, but a living connection between two networks of obligation. Because of this, early settlements were often family clusters. A village might begin as the home base of a leading figure, but it quickly became the home of his relatives as well. Over time, those relatives expanded into a tight community that could act together, defend each other, and absorb the consequences of a dispute. That is why so many early place names point back to founders and their people. These were not just dots on a map. They were organized groups rooted in blood ties, working land side by side and standing together in court. Those kin networks were not infinite. People kept track of how far responsibility stretched, because at some point the tie faded into memory. Medieval writers describe limits beyond which kinship no longer counted in law. That boundary mattered for inheritance, for marriage, for compensation, and for the right to call someone to stand as an oath helper. The deeper the network, the stronger the defence. A man with many reliable relatives had a better chance of surviving an accusation than a man who stood alone. Over time, powerful families tried to cut themselves loose from poorer relatives, because kinship could become a burden. If your distant cousin caused trouble, your family could be dragged into the cost. Kings also had reasons to weaken these private power structures. A society governed by family revenge and family alliances could easily slip into feuds that the crown could not control. So the law gradually encouraged people to abandon guilty relatives, and the church created another escape route by separating monks from ordinary family claims. Step by step, the old tribal web was stretched thinner. Yet the fingerprints of that world remained everywhere. Local courts were built around free men gathering in the open air to judge disputes. People were expected to show up, to take part, and to keep the peace of their district. Justice was not delivered by distant officials alone. It was performed locally, by communities that still carried the memory of older tribal order. Even long after conquest and new rulers, many districts kept their own habits, and some places continued to act as if the village itself owned the land rather than a lord. And then, when you move from law courts to inheritance, the same deep diversity appears. Not all settlers arrived with the same rules for land. In some places, the youngest inherited. In others, the eldest. In others, the land was shared. These differences were not small legal quirks. They were signals of migration and mixture. Different groups brought different traditions, and England became a patchwork where old customs survived in pockets, protected by local memory. Kent is the most dramatic example. For centuries it stood apart, not because it had a different king, but because it kept a different idea of fairness. Land there was traditionally divided among heirs, rather than passed whole to one child. This made Kent feel like a county with its own inherited personality. A region marked by a rule older than the courts that later tried to standardise England. In most of the country, the eldest son slowly rose to dominance. In Kent, the older logic of sharing held its ground. Even the origin story of Kent's earliest settlers carries that sense of layered identity. Early writers speak of Jutes arriving as the founding force, but older northern traditions connect these people to the wider Gothic world of the Baltic and Scandinavia. Legends tell of migrations in a small number of ships, as if the memory of different groups travelling together hardened into a symbolic number passed down through generations. Whether the details are literal or not, the pattern matters. It suggests that early settlement was rarely one tribe alone, but often a coalition. When you look at early Kent, the clues don't point to one single people. The strongest pattern suggests a mix, with groups we would today connect to the Gothic world and to the coastal Frisian zones, all gathered under the broad label that later writers used for Kent's founders. What matters is not the label itself, but what survived. The everyday rules of land, family, and legal privilege in Kent looked less like leftover Celtic practice, and more like customs carried in by newcomers, and then defended stubbornly for centuries. Land sharing is the key example. Splitting property among heirs is common across many societies, so it only becomes meaningful when you examine the details that come attached to it. In Kent, only legitimate sons were counted when the land was divided. If there were no sons, daughters could inherit, and the widow had a protected claim to a major share of her husband's property. Those 3 points separate Kent sharply from the inheritance rules recorded for Wales, where all sons claimed shares, daughters were pushed aside, and widows did not receive the same built-in security. That contrast matters because it suggests Kent's system followed a different cultural logic, not simply the same island tradition with local variations. Kent also kept unusually strong ideas about what a young man was allowed to do at an early age. In some northern legal traditions, a son was treated as grown enough to act in property matters around his 15th year, and Kent shows a similar threshold. That detail seems small, but in a world where adulthood was a legal category, tied to land and duty. It hints at connections across the North Sea rather than a purely local English development. The same is true of another Kentish oddity. Landlords could not always use the standard method of seizing goods to force payment. Instead, there were special local procedures for recovering what was owed. This kind of protection for tenants is rare enough to stand out, and when you line it up with older northern legal habits that discourage simple seizure, the resemblance becomes hard to ignore. Kentish landholding also carried a strong sense of family ownership. The land often behaved like a family possession, not just a piece of property that could be treated casually or absorbed easily into outside control. That mindset fits a society where kinship and household stability mattered more than abstract legal theory. It even appears inside the inheritance system itself. In Kent, land was divided, but the home base was treated differently. The youngest son tended to be linked to the hearth and homestead, while the eldest often had first pick among the parcels once the estate was split. In other words, the system tried to protect both ends of family survival, the continuity of the household and the senior status of the firstborn. The widow's position is another powerful clue. Across England, widows received different shares depending on local custom. In some places, the share was limited, in others, it was generous. Kent stands out because the widow's entitlement was large and deeply rooted. And beyond Kent, similar traditions appear in northern societies where marriage involved the husband's gift, securing the wife's future, rather than the wife bringing wealth into the marriage. That kind of rule is not just economics, it is a social statement. The household is meant to survive the man's death, and the woman is not left exposed. Then there is the evidence carved into stone. In eastern Kent, certain ancient inscriptions were cut using an older runic tradition, rather than the later Scandinavian style. Fixed stone monuments matter because they can't be explained away as portable objects carried by travellers. A brooch can move. A heavy stone cannot. Their presence on the Kent coast points to people settled there early, before Christianization fully reshaped public life. And the fact that these finds cluster toward the east fits an old division inside Kent itself. East and West were treated almost like distinct provinces, with separate identities that survived in language and tradition. Later, records still speak of the people of East Kent and West Kent, as if they were not quite the same. Even the human landscape seems to support a mixed settlement. Observers have long noted that different parts of Kent show different physical patterns, suggesting that the county was never one uniform population. Coastal areas with darker features, inland zones with different face shapes, and long-standing local labels for Eastern and Western Kentish identity all hint at layers of settlement rather than one wave that replaced everything before it. Money, surprisingly, also tells part of the story. Early Kent used a system that looks unusual compared with other English kingdoms, and its values line up neatly with northern standards of weight and silver. When a society measures wealth in a way that matches an overseas world, it can point to trade, to shared habits, or to people who arrived already trained to think in those units. Either way, it suggests Kent was plugged into northern networks very early, not isolated at the edge of the island. Kent's greatest long-term signature, though, was freedom. In the Middle Ages, being Kent-born carried a kind of legal pride. A Kentish man could move, resist being treated as a bonded labourer elsewhere, and defend his status by pointing to his birth. That sort of county-wide personal liberty is extraordinary in a feudal age, and it looks less like something invented late and more like an inherited tradition that the population refused to surrender. London had a comparable aura of freedom for those born within it, but in the countryside, Kent was the standout. Once you shift west into Sussex, the story changes again. Sussex is not marked by land being shared, but by something harsher, the youngest son inheriting everything on many manors. That rule survives more strongly there than anywhere else in England, and it looks like a fossil of an older custom carried in by settlers. Kent, in a weaker form, still gives the youngest a special connection to the home base. Sussex pushes the idea to the extreme, turning it into total inheritance for the last-born. If you place the two counties side by side, you can almost see a shared preference for the youngest son expressed in two different systems, as if similar instincts met different local pressures. And then the place names in Sussex start whispering about another layer, connections to peoples from the southern Baltic and the lands east of the Elbe, where Slavic groups once dominated. When you find inheritance rules that resemble Eastern patterns, and you also find names that echo Wendish or related identities, the coincidence becomes harder to dismiss. It suggests that the southeast was not settled by one clean ethnic bloc, but by overlapping groups arriving through the same seaways, mixing near borders, and leaving behind different legal habits in different pockets. Along the far western edge of Sussex, near the old coastal seat of Selsey, a small name opens a surprisingly wide doorway into the early settlement story. A place now called Wittering appears in 10th century records in an older form, and the logic behind that older spelling points toward a personal name that may once have carried a tribal identity with it. The hint is that some settlers were remembered not only as individuals, but as people tied to distant northern groups, whose names echoed across the sea routes that linked Britain to the Baltic and the North Sea. What makes Sussex feel unusual is the way different kinds of north seem to overlap in the landscape. Some names sound as if they belong to communities with links to the eastern Baltic world, where Swedish coastal provinces faced Finland across cold water. Other names carry the flavour of settlers remembered as Eastern men in a broad sense, a label that could mean different things depending on who was speaking and when. You even find local place clusters that suggest family groups, rather than random naming. Repeated endings, repeated roots, repeated patterns that look like settlement fingerprints, rather than poetic coincidence. Then there are the quieter clues. Names that resemble old terms for Finns, and another that looks like it might preserve the memory of people who were seen as foreigners, even among foreigners. Alongside these are names that sound like they could point to Swedish connections. The point is not that every name is a perfect match, but that the density of these hints along one coastline is hard to ignore. Sussex was open to the sea, and the sea was a highway, not a wall. Archaeology adds an extra spark to the picture. In one Sussex burial ground, a rare weapon turned up that almost never appears in early English graves, but is common in continental graves associated with certain Western European groups. One object cannot rewrite the whole story, yet it fits a broader pattern. Sussex doesn't look like a single origin settlement zone. It looks like a place where different streams of people arrived close enough together that their material habits could sit side by side in the same ground. That helps explain one of Sussex's most famous survivals, the inheritance rule that favoured the youngest child. Across large parts of Sussex, the youngest son could inherit the whole holding, shutting out older brothers. This is a strong blunt rule, and it doesn't match what you would expect if the county had been settled only by the groups usually imagined as standard South Saxons. The best parallels for this kind of youngest takes all practice lie farther east in Europe, among communities where such a rule helped stop farms from being split into helpless fragments generation after generation. Over time, societies under pressure often choose one heir simply to keep the land viable. Sussex preserves that logic more clearly than anywhere else in southern England. But the story isn't as simple as saying one people brought one rule. In the real world, customs spread. Communities living side by side borrow what works, especially if marriage, trade, and shared defence tie them together. Even in parts of Germany in later centuries, law and local necessity pushed land toward youngest inheritance for practical reasons. So, in Sussex, it's plausible that the custom arrived through a mix. Some settlers brought it fully formed, others adopted it after living next to people who used it. And over time, it became a local identity marker. The place names reinforce this sense of mixture. Sussex is packed with names ending in a sound like mer or mere, and many of them sit on high ground where marsh explanations feel weak. These endings look more like old boundary language than descriptions of wetland. In older Eastern European traditions, similar sounds can carry ideas of community, land, and ordered space. The result is a county map dotted with names that feel less like scenery and more like old administrative edges, older settlement zones, older lines that once mattered. At the same time, the Frisian presence in Sussex is difficult to miss. The county's name patterns repeatedly resemble coastal naming habits from the North Sea world, including endings that still sound like they belong to that zone when spoken aloud. Local pronunciations even preserve a kind of echo. The way certain endings soften into or un feels closer to Frisian speech habits than to later standardized English. And when you add in clusters of names that resemble those found in old Frisian coastal areas, the implication is clear. People from that shoreline were part of the Sussex mix. Some name clusters also suggest specific Frisian subgroups. You can trace repeated roots that feel like family settlement markers, the kind you would expect if a small community arrived together, held land together, and named the place after the group identity that outsiders recognized. In a world where law, oath-taking, and mutual responsibility were rooted in kinship, naming the settlement after the group makes perfect sense. It tells neighbouring communities who you are and who will stand beside you in court or in feud. Add to this later Scandinavian layers. Sussex, like every maritime county, didn't just experience one wave. Later centuries brought new arrivals, new pockets of settlement, and new local rules that sit awkwardly beside older ones. In some manners, one kind of land followed eldest inheritance, while another kind followed youngest inheritance, as if two settlement moments were stitched into the same parish. The older fields behaved like ancestral land with fixed custom, while newer cleared land behaved like fresh property that defaulted to a different rule. That kind of split makes sense if one layer of people arrived early, established a tradition, and a later layer expanded into forest clearings under different assumptions. When you follow this pattern north into Surrey, the trail continues. Certain Surrey manors kept the same youngest inheritance rule, and even kept local administrative structures that resemble Sussex practice. The distribution is not random. It hugs routes that connect the Sussex coast to inland markets and ultimately to London. That looks like movement, families relocating, forming new communities, carrying the inheritance rule with them like a badge of identity. In the wooded borderlands between Sussex, Surrey, and Kent, you can also see the signs of blending. Some places preserve customs that resemble Kentish land, freedom and easy transfer, while neighbouring places preserve the Sussex youngest inheritance rule. It's as if the Weald became a contact zone where settlers from both directions met, married, traded, argued, and gradually built mixed local traditions that don't fit neatly into one county stereotype. Even the old local meeting districts tell the same story. Sussex ended up with an unusually large number of small administrative units, suggesting that early settlement didn't arrive as one giant, unified block. Instead, it looks like many small communities, each with its own local gatherings and its own internal rules, later grouped under a broader kingdom name. That matches the broader impression. Sussex was South Saxon by political label, but socially and ethnically it carried more than one thread. Physical anthropology, as far as early cemetery evidence can suggest, also hints at variety. Some burial groups show a strong dominance of long-headed skull forms associated with parts of the North Sea coastal world, while a smaller minority shows broader forms that could reflect either older local ancestry or newcomers from continental regions where both types lived side by side. The simplest explanation is not one pure race and one intrusive exception, but a coastline where different kinds of people were arriving and living together early enough for their descendants to become just Sussex in later memory.